Hello everyone, it's Elbone here. Alright, so you're here to find out what mobility does, and fortunately for you, I've spent the past few weeks researching and double checking all of the information that I've put in this guide. Before I start talking about mobility, I'd like to credit Pippin's Destiny 2 data compendium, as well as you/Christignite's breakdown of mobility as sources of like a plethora of information over the years. I mean, it's guides like these that keep me going. Without their breakdowns, this video would have taken much longer to come out. Their links will be in the description below, make sure to check them out. To set the parameters of this guide, I'm only going to go over the stat mobility and not the concept of mobility. I'm saving that one for a future video. So to understand mobility, you first have to understand what stats are. So there are 6 stats in the game which can generally be divided into 2 subsections. The top half of stats, mobility, resilience, and recovery, are passives that affect moment-to-moment gameplay. In addition to those passives, what class you play determines which of these stats affect your class ability recharge rate. Titans have resilience and warlocks have recovery, but hunters have mobility, so that's what we're going to be covering today. Next up, you have the bottom half of the stats. That's discipline, intellect, and strength. These affect your grenade, super, and melee recharge rates respectively. Every 10 stat points you get will give you a tier of that stat. Tiers are what actually change the benefits that you get from your stats. So an example would be a Guardian with 81 resilience and a Guardian with 89 resilience both have tier 8 resilience, so they both get the exact same benefit from resilience. All stats cap out at tier 10 or 100 of that stat. So that's a brief overview of how stats work in Destiny 2, but right now, there's only one that we care about, and that is mobility. So to answer the question of the title, what is mobility? Well, mobility is a stat that dictates 3 things: move speed, base jump height, and hunter dodge cooldown. Before we move on, I just want to get it out there, mobility does not affect sprint speed whatsoever. However, we will be going over things that do increase sprint speed, so stay tuned for that. Mobility gives a 4% increase to move speed and base jump height per level. So in terms of the flat benefit that you get on paper, yes, mobility is the only one that scales linearly as shown in this chart. There's the rate of change, the blue bar, and that's staying the same. Most stats in this game don't scale linearly, however mobility does. Sort of. Before we open up that can of worms, let's go over what move speed means. There's 3 different move speeds that are affected by mobility. There's forward walking speed, which is just holding W, and that has a base value of 5 meters per second. There's also strafing, which has a base speed of 4.25 meters per second, and that's moving left, right, and backwards. And finally, there's sneaking, which is moving around while you're crouched, and that comes in at a speed of 2.75 meters per second. This chart here shows what each speed is going to be at different tiers of mobility. Strafe speed is where it starts getting a little weird. Machine guns and rockets both reduce your strafe and walk speed by 15% while they're out. Cool! What's even cooler is how 1K Voices also has this effect. However, it doesn't apply to the forward walking speed? Meaning with 1K Voices you'll strafe slower but you can walk forward normally for some reason? It should be noted that Sleeper Simulate has the exact same penalties to strafe speed as 1K Voices. It's strange, but not as strange as Legend of Acrius, which drastically reduces your strafe and jump speed even when it's not out. You just have to have it equipped in your inventory. Aiming down sights will reduce your strafe speed by 25%, unless you're using a sidearm, in which case it only reduces your strafe speed by 15%. Moving target and stasis elemental capacitor reduce the penalty for ADSing by 3% and 5%. Peacekeepers make SMGs only reduce your strafe speed by 9%. So theoretically, if you combined moving target or stasis ECAP with Peacekeepers on an SMG, you can schmoove while ADSing. If you block with swords, it'll slow your walk speed by 20% and your strafe speed by 25%. So as a recap, forward walking speed, or just walking, is holding W or forward. Strafing is moving left, right, or backwards, also known as hitting A, S, and D. And sneaking is just any movement while you're crouched that isn't sliding. Speaking of sliding, let's go over that. So every slide buff in the game only buffs slide by 33%, except for Cryoclasm, which is 50%. Sources of increased slide distance in the game include Vigilant Swing, Transversive Steps, Dunemarchers, Stompies, Antaeus Wards, Peacekeepers with an SMG equipped, and Dragon's Shadow for 9 seconds after you dodge. All of those give you a 33% increase in your slide distance. However, as I mentioned before, Cryoclasm for Stasis Titans gives you plus 50% slide distance, the farthest in the game. Okay, sneak speed time. So looking around, there weren't many sources of sneak speed in the game. The only things that do directly modify sneak speed other than mobility are Echo of Dilation and Transversive Steps, which each set the sneak speed to 4 meters per second, which is faster than tier 10 mobility. So if you ever wanted to sneak fast, use one of those. Alright, so next up is jump height. Mobility only affects your base jump height and not jump abilities. If you didn't know, the longer you hold down the jump button, the higher your jump gets. So even though mobility scales linearly in terms of move speed, it actually isn't linear when it comes to jumping. On screen I've marked where the apex of each jump was. As you can see from the line, the rate of change actually isn't linear. Okay, finally, the part that most of you have been waiting for, sprint speed. So technically speaking, all sprint speed boosts are actually boosts to all forward movement. This means that it also applies to your walk speed, or just holding W or forward. Here's two hunters with 100 mobility walking forward. The left one doesn't have any sprint speed buffs, while the one on the right has 1 sprint speed buff. Even though they have the same mobility, the one with the sprint speed buff is walking faster. Speaking of 100 mobility, let's talk about how mobility affects sprint speed. So here's two hunters, but this time, the one on the left has tier 0 mobility, and the one on the right has tier 10 mobility. As you can see, despite them having the largest mobility difference in the game, they both hit the wall at the same time. Again, sprint speed is not affected by mobility. Alright, let's talk numbers. The most sprint speed you can have is a 12.5% increase. Now that 12.5% cap cannot be exceeded. Most sprint speed buffs in the game are 6.25%. This is exactly half of the max benefit, which is why a lot of the time you'll see people running 2 sprint speed boosts, but not 3, because you only need 2 to hit the cap most of the time. So there's 3 different tiers of sprint speed boost. There are low-level sprint speed buffs, which only buff it by half of the max amount, a strange mid-tier which gives plus 10%, and finally there are a couple sources in the game where you can get a full plus 12.5% sprint speed. On screen now, there's 4 hunters all sprinting with different sprint speed increases. From left to right, we have no sprint speed increase, 1 sprint speed increase at 6.25%, the Midas sprint speed buff, that's 10%, and the rightmost hunter has both Stompies and a lightweight weapon, so they're sprinting at the max sprint speed of 12.5%. So if you didn't know, there are some exotic weapons that have lightweight weapon bonuses. Chaperone, Fighting Lion, and Lemon Arc all inherit lightweight weapon frame bonuses. Mida Multitool has a modified version of a lightweight frame. This gives it that plus 10% sprint speed, however, it also maintains the plus 20 mobility while you hold it. So in terms of the 6.25, or half, sprint speed buff, we got Dragon's Shadow for 9 seconds after dodging, lightweight frame weapons, and it should be noted that Mida Mini Tool counts as a lightweight weapon unless you have Mida Multi-Tool equipped. We'll get to that. Frosties, but only for 10 seconds after you dodge. Stompies, Dunemarchers, and Transversive Steps, so that's 3 sprint speed exotics. Peacekeepers, but only when you have an SMG equipped. Vigilant Swing, while Harsh Truths is active. And Focus Breathing on Arc Hunter, although Arc is getting changed, so that we'll have to see. Speaking of Arc, there's also some weird stuff with Arc Warlock that we'll talk about at the end of the video. Alright, so here's the weird mid-tier of sprint speed buffs. So the Mida series of weapons is the only source of plus 10% sprint speed. Mida Multitool always has this buff, but Mida Mini Tool only gets the buff when you have Mida Multitool equipped. So if you have both of them get the 10% buff. If you don't have both, it's only the Multi-Tool. Alright, finally there's the big buffs, and these are the ones that give you plus 12.5% sprint speed, the full cap. These are the buffs that when they proc, you can feel it hitting. Unfortunately, there's only 3 sources of it in the game, however. Tractor Cannon, when Scientific Method is procced, increases all of your move speed to the max, including sprint. Assassin's Blade will give you plus 12.5% after you get a kill with a sword, and then there's Heart Shadow, which gives you a max sprint speed buff while you're invisible. However, you do have to have sword ammo for it to kick in. I imagine that change was made because of PvP. Alright, so that's everything that mobility does. I think it's time we discuss how you start getting mobility. Like any stat in the game, you get mobility mainly through armor. However, I imagine you already knew that. Alright, so I'm going to give you a complete list of everything in the game that gives you mobility. I'm going to split this list into 2 halves, which I'm calling passive and active. When I say passive, I mean armor and armor mods and fragments which affect your mobility that you can see on your character screen. When I say active, I mean temporary buffs which give you mobility. These buffs cannot be seen on the character screen. I double checked and this should be everything in the game in terms of mobility. However, if anything is missing, please let me know in the comments below. Alright, let's start with passive mobility. So the minor mobility mod gives you plus 5, the mobility mod gives you plus 10, powerful friends gives you plus 20, charge harvester takes away 10 from hunters, whisper of hunger gives minus 10 mobility and minus 10 recovery, echo of persistence gives minus 10 mobility to hunters, echo of dilation gives plus 10 mobility and plus 10 intellect. Alright, now let's talk about active mobility, or the buffs. Even though these buffs don't show up on the character screen, they do increase your mobility, therefore they do decrease hunter dodge cooldown. So for example, if you have tier 8 mobility but hold out a lightweight weapon for the whole time after you dodge, having plus 20 mobility, you would end up with 100 mobility during your dodge cooldown. This means that your dodge that should have a tier 8 cooldown will have a tier 10 cooldown instead. So lightweight frames and the Midas series of weapons give plus 20 mobility while it's out. Killing Wind gives you plus 50 for 8 seconds. Echo of Domineering gives you plus 30 for 10 seconds. Whisper of Hedrons gives you plus 60 for 11 seconds. Dragon's Shadow gives you plus 50 for 9 seconds after you dodge. Vigilance Wing will give you plus 20 mobility while Harsh Truths is active. Teraba will give you plus 100 mobility while Ravenous Beast is active. Peacekeepers with an SMG gives plus 50, which means if you have a lightweight SMG and Peacekeepers, that's plus 70 mobility. So that's all the ways that you get mobility in Destiny 2. There is, however, an edge case or two, but I'll be going over that later and you'll see why. Alright, on to Hunter Dodge. Hunter Dodge follows the same principles as other abilities in Destiny 2, in that 30 mobility is considered the base cooldown, and going below that will increase your cooldown, while going above that will decrease the cooldown. There's currently 3 dodges in the game. There's Marksman's Dodge, Gambler's Dodge, and Acrobat's Dodge. Technically there is a 4th dodge with Mask of Acrius, however it adds a flat 10 seconds to whichever dodge you have equipped. It should be noted you can't use Acrobat's Dodge with Mask of Acrius given that Mask of Acrius is only for stasis. Marksman Dodge scales from 41 seconds to 14 seconds at tier 10 mobility. Gambler's goes from 54 seconds to 19, and Acrobat's goes from 117 down to 41. Alright, let's talk about slow real quick. Slow lowers your jump height by 30%, makes it so you can't mantle, disables your movement abilities, and it lowers weapon handling, weapon reload speed, lowers the weapon recoil direction stat, and it increases the flinch you take. Okay, so this next part of the video is going to be the miscellaneous section where we talk about edge cases. As I mentioned before, Legend of Acrius is a fucking nightmare weapon. Legend of Acrius gives a flat jump height and stray speed reduction. This can make your tier 0 jump and stray speed even slower. If you ever wanted to feel like you weigh 500 pounds, here you go! The other heavy weapons that apply movement penalties are percents, whereas this one is just a flat nuke of all of your move speed. Except it isn't all your move speed, because your forward walking speed is the same. The weirdest part is that while Acrius is in your loadout you get the debuff. You don't need to have it equipped. If it's in your heavy slot, you just stray slower and don't jump as high. I was actually testing this with Blink because I thought it would be a neat way to allow you to blink forward more consistently. But the problem is that lowering the strafe speed makes it completely unusable. If it only had the jump height reduction, I actually think this might be a niche tech for blink users. But unfortunately it isn't, so it isn't. So Arc Warlocks have Pulse Wave and Electromagnetic Surge. I'm only going to cover these briefly since Arc 3.0 is coming out soon, so this part will probably be out of date by then. I'll try and put up a pinned comment when the patch is live to show off the changes. Pulse Wave increases your strafe and walking speed to that of 100 mobility but doesn't give sprint speed. Now that's relatively simple compared to Electromagnetic Surge. E-Surge gives you more of a benefit based off of how little mobility you have. The less you spec into mobility, the more of a benefit it gives you. It is still better to have high mobility with it, because even though you aren't getting as big of a bump, your base mobility is so much higher that you're still going to be walking faster. Regardless of your mobility, E-Surge will max out at 3 stacks with max sprint speed and max walk speed. So that's plus 12.5% and plus 40%. So there's only one source of mobility that I didn't end up testing, and that's Umbral Hastening. Umbral Hastening is a mod from Vow of the Disciple that gives you mobility if you have 4 stacks of Pervading Darkness. I couldn't find how much mobility this mod gives, and I think it's extremely niche, and personally not very good, especially considering you could have the plus damage mod instead, and it's only in specific encounters in Vow. Alright, and that's the end of my guide. Hopefully I've given you what you were looking for out of this video, and in the future I'll be making more of these guides. I plan on doing 6 more, 1 more for each of the stats, and then a final mega video that just covers, like, everything. If there's anything in this video I've gotten wrong, please let me know in the comments so I can fix it. I do not want to be spreading misinformation. Make sure you like the video if you found it informative, or I at least staved off your boredom for a little bit. Subscribe to my channel if you want to see the rest of this series and future guides. I also make funny videos of me and my clan, like, doing stuff. I spend a lot of time editing those videos as well, so go check them out if you want to have a laugh or two. Alternatively, it could just make you cringe, so there's that too. Alright, well that's now for all. It's been a blast.
He was on the side of the video game the whole time.